Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We have 12 o'clock and we want to get started. We have a lot to say and do. So I just want to start out by saying I am Peggy West. I'm your organizer for the webinar. And hello to everyone and welcome to the webinar. This is by the Overton Network. The Overton Network is a monthly commitment by Paul Overton, who's the CEO of Overton Construction, providing educational speakers and to the associations related to construction laws. So this is his vision. He's been putting these on monthly since November of last year. And I'm really excited today to introduce our sponsor, our speaker for today, which is Nick Brenneman. If you want to just wave at this time and we'll come back to you, Nick. The laws have changed, so you all know, and Paul thought it'd be a great idea that we hear from an industry resource regarding all the reserve changes and things you want to know. This is going to be recorded and we will be able to send out the slides to everyone following the event. I want to give you some housekeeping notes here. If you have questions, put that into the Q&A. And if you want to just make an announcement, the sponsors, you want to put your contact information in there, put it in the chat box. Today, this CAM credit is going to be a 1 hour. It's either going to be an IFM credit or an ELE elective credit. I want to ask you, please allow 3 to 4 weeks for your credit to get posted. That's including the office at Reserve Advisors and then the DBPR to get it uploaded. And they are running a little bit behind, I heard. So just be patient. Okay, at the end of this, you're going to receive a sponsor sheet with everyone's contact information. And like I said, it's going to be recorded. So let's get started with introducing our sponsors. I'll start with myself. I also work for Beach and Patio Outdoor Living. We are full service in business, almost 50 years with outdoor pool and patio furniture. We have new furniture. We now have pre-owned furniture. I have financing for you. And we have an excellent reputation in reslinging and restrapping furniture. So if you need anything and everything to do with furniture, let me know. Just give me a call on the sponsor sheet. I'll have my number. Next, I want to introduce Katie Bassford. She's the National Account Executive and my IT support today with Vinteum Software. Katie, talk to us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peggy. As Peggy mentioned, I am the National Account Executive, so I work with clients all across the U.S., but we do have a particular focus in Florida. Vinteum provides an HOA and condo management platform. We can help improve communication and transparency amongst your HOA, and we can also help you stay compliant. I know there's lots of new Florida laws coming out regarding condo associations and homeowners associations, so we can ensure that your community is staying compliant with all those new regulations. So if you are curious, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your efforts today. Next, I want to introduce Brian Rammel. He is the Marketing and Business Development Rep for United Professional Engineering. Brian, tell us about yourself and the company, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for hosting yet another great webinar, Peggy. As she said, my name is Brian Rammel. I represent United Professional Engineering. We are a structural engineering firm located here in Lake Worth Beach. Been in business for about 18 plus years. The founder of the company, his name is Carmelo Giglio. He is very accredited, and we stand on the name of the company. We are all about our professionalism, and that includes the people that we work with. Carmelo actually is geared up to be the next president for Florida Structural Engineering Association, and he also helped with the Senate bill after the Chamberlain Tower collapse. If anyone has any questions or any inspection or engineering needs, we'd love to help you out and take a look. I dropped my information in the chat. And thank you again for allowing us to be a sponsor, Peggy.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, next I want to introduce Michelle Sidlowski. Is she on? Oh, there you are. Hi. Okay. Michelle is the Assistant Vice President for Home Association Relationships and Commercial Banking. Michelle, tell us about yourself, what you do, and what does a bank do for associations?
Hi, my name is Michelle Sidlowski, and I am the I am with the Association Services Division of City National Bank. We've been around about 75 years via acquisitions. We service over 4,000 associations throughout the state of Florida. We are the second largest Florida-based bank, so we don't do any business outside of Florida. We're headquartered in Coral Gables. I'm based in Tampa, cover the West Coast down to Naples, out to Orlando, up to Jacksonville. We do have about 35 branches in the state. I can work with you on lockbox, lending, anything to do with your homeowner and condo association banking needs, we can assist. And as it relates to today's conversation, we are working with communities who need to borrow to help fund projects, repairs, building envelopes, anything that's that they need to. There may be a shortfall. We can certainly take a look to see if lending is a possibility. So happy to have a conversation with you, your board members, whomever. Sometimes it's just a special assessment, but thank you for having me, Peggy, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much and for joining once again. Next, I want to introduce the Hafer Company. The representative is Nicole Johnson Pendergrass. She's a partner and the operations manager. Again, unfortunately, not able to get on today, swamped with work. They do have 4 offices. They are very notable and recognized for their many associations that they work with among 4 offices in the state. So if you need a good CPA service, need audits, or want something checked, please call Nicole on the sponsor sheet. Next, I want to introduce a new sponsor for my webinars, Daniel Baum. He's the founder, the CEO for Commercial Property Insurance. He is a specialist with COA Solutions. Daniel, introduce yourself, please, and what do you do for associations?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Peggy. Appreciate the introduction. Very simply, I am truly passionate about trying to help associations bring down the cost of their commercial property insurance. This is obviously a very hot topic going on the last 2 years here in Florida, if not all over the country. And unfortunately, many communities are facing situations where they're either getting renewal pricing at the very last minute, or they're not, some of the carriers or agents are not being fully transparent with what's going on, or maybe even if it's not bad actors, it's just not taking proactive steps to understanding what you can actually do to bring down the cost of your insurance. And there are things you can do. So I spend every day, all day, talking to communities and property managers about ways that we can do that in advance and staying proactive. And we've been extremely successful this year. We've saved our clients already over $1 million in premium. And so that's what I do. If anybody needs some help or just some guidance for someone to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to help.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Welcome. And he'll also be on the sponsor sheet. Next, I want to introduce Steve Mason. He's the National Director of Business Development for Altieri Insurance Consultants. Steve, tell us about yourself and leave it to 2 minutes. Just laugh. Just kidding.
Peggy knows I like to talk. It's the Latin in me. Well, thanks, Peggy, for the introduction. Yes, Steve Mason with Altieri Insurance Consultants. We are a national public adjusting company. We also do consultation. My experience is 20 years in the association management business. I left 6 years ago to get involved in the claims business because that's where I saw a third of your budget is going towards, and I wanted to learn more about that. We've been helping associations with all type of property losses, floods, fires, and of course, the inevitable hurricane and/or tropical storm. We have a great pre-loss program that I've signed many associations up. Other than priority response, the great part about the pre-loss program is we do a great policy review on your property policy to make sure you have adequate coverage, the right endorsements and limits for your community. Our founder, we've been in business since 1988. Our founder, Ray Altieri Jr., started a group called FAPIA, the Florida Association of Public Insurance Adjusters. We have board seats on that group and on the National Associations of Public Insurance Adjusters, where we currently hold the president and secretary seat. There is no other public adjustment company that volunteers the amount of time that we do to fight bad insurance legislation. So we are always in the know of what's going on in the insurance business. And then we also help you out with your large loss claims, even if it's something you need consultation on. I urge everybody to contact me regarding our pre-loss program. It's a great non-binding zero cost program. We're just here to help you and be a resource for you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to say that Steve's very, what's the word?
I don't know, be careful, Pevin.
Yeah. He's experienced for sure, but very modest. That's what I was looking for. He is the former president of CAI down here at Southeast in South Florida. Been with CAI many years. He originally was a property manager. So all you CAMs out there, he knows what he's talking about. Board members, he's an excellent resource. And thank you for joining us today as a sponsor.
Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate that.
Next is Stratus Roofing. I want to introduce Chelsea Lintz. She's the Business Development Manager. And Chelsea, tell us about yourself and where you're located and what you do and what all does Stratus do.
Thank you, Peggy. Hello, everyone. I am Chelsea Lintz with Stratus Roofing, and we are your local super roofer. So we are the commercial industry leading roofer in the state of Florida. And what we do is we do commercial, any type of commercial between multifamily, condos, townhomes, anything we can help with, any type of roofing systems. And more than anything, we just want to be, involved in a resource for communities just to help you. We do everything from just coming out and giving a current condition report to a reserve report as well, to maybe just know what your community is going to need to save for potential roofing projects in the future. Repairs, right now, 90% of the requests that we've been getting for inspections have been for repairs, and they've turned into larger scopes of work than what initially was known. So let us know if we can help. Free assessments, and we're here for you. Thank you.
That's great. I also want to make my honorable mention of Ed Renke. He's also with Stratus, and he's the Vice President of Business Development, and both will be on the sponsor sheet to reach out to. Next, I want to introduce Heidi Larson. She's a Business Development Executive for Florida Paints. Heidi, tell us about yourself and the company, please.
Thanks so much, Peggy. My name is Heidi Larson, like she said, and I work for Florida Paints. We're a paint manufacturing company local to Florida. Right now, we are working closely with a lot of management companies and properties for their repaints. This is the time to do it, and we've been working with them on color renderings, which we do as a courtesy to each of the properties that are repainting different colors and changing colors. We'll walk you guys through and help with updating your color book schemes. We also vet all of our contractors. So we make sure that anybody that we recommend for your project is the correct size for your project. With the milestone studies and all the defects we have in Florida, we have a lot of out-of-state guys coming in to get a piece of that pie. And so we make sure that we're vetting who we put onto your projects, that they're going to be around later. That's really important because, if something comes up, you want to make sure that they're going to be around to help fix it. So we do that. We take care of all of the steps for the repaint, from, this paint specification and the warranties, the color changes or color matches, to the on-site management to make sure that they're putting enough millage on the side of the building to keep your warranty valid. So if you have any repaints coming up, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my information in the section and she'll send it out with the sponsorship list. Thanks, Peggy.
You're certainly welcome. Thank you so much, and good luck with all your projects. Next, I'm going to mention Vice Painting. They buy quite a bit through Heidi Larson there at Florida Paints. Again, locally up there in Central Florida region. Maddie Osman is the Director of Marketing and Business Strategy. I also want to make honorable mention of her leader and owner, Jean Ponder. So I will just move on. I'm not sure their whole area that they cover, but I do know that they're pretty widespread. Next, I want to introduce a new company also. Unfortunately, they had to go and take on to a project today, but South Blue Solutions. You can look them up on the internet, you guys, southbluesolutions.com. And all you condos that have a big association, theater, or things like that, they do the LED lighting. They can make your events and your weddings and all of your different events just really light up and very special and very memorable. So the contact there is Brian Rodriguez, and honorable mention is Gabriel Neto. So with that, I was hoping Paul would be on by now, but Paul Overton, he had to go to a project meeting. We thought he was going to be back by now. He is the founder of the Overton Network, as I mentioned before. He's also the CEO of Overton Construction. I want to make honorable mention of his partner in crime there, Sherry Hall, Vice President of Business Development. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Brenneman. He's a regional account manager at Reserve Advisors, and he's also going to be today's presenter. So Nick, take it away.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks for having me. It's a real honor. And after those intros, it's clear to see that I'm in great company today. So what a great group of business partners here serving condos and HOAs. I'm so glad that everyone took some time out of their day to join us and learn a little bit about reserve studies, specifically the structural integrity reserve studies, which I'm sure you've heard of. And today we're going to break it down a little bit so you understand exactly what the requirements are and also what they are not. So ever since SB4D passed in 2022, there's been a lot of confusion, inconsistency, misunderstanding when it comes to the requirements with the reserve studies and structural reserve studies. And so I would like to kind of go through some of that today and set the record straight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you guys can follow along with the presentation. I trust you can see that title slide. Safety in SIRS, reserves to the rescue. The idea here being that these structural reserves are really integral to building safety, which is what the legislative intent was when they created this study. I'm Nick Brenneman. I'm the regional account manager for Reserve Advisors here in the Southeast. We've been doing reserve studies for over 30 years. We've been doing SIRS since they were essentially created. I've been with the firm, this will be 14 years in December. So I've seen a lot of change as this industry has evolved, but I've never seen anything like this. And I know it's not unique to the reserve study world. It's just condos, we're in uncharted territory right now. So I'm excited to be in a position to help a lot of folks meet these requirements and implement these plans to safeguard their buildings and keep them financially stable. So the agenda today is, first we're going to cover what is a reserve study, just basic foundational understanding. Then we'll look at the existing statutes, because the idea of regulating reserves is not a new thing in Florida. In fact, condos have been subject to 718, which has certain reserve requirements for a very long time. Then we'll look at why change. So really what drove this change. And then we'll get into what the specific changes are when it relates to the SIRS. And then my favorite part is the best practices for implementation, which is really one thing that I think is very unique to this information today is we're going to look at some real world examples of funding the structural reserves. And, everybody's kind of working through the deadline, getting it in before the end of the year. But the next phase is going to be implementing those findings and those funding recommendations. And it's really going to be critically important as a board, as property managers, that we know a thing or two about reserve funding so that we can make sure that we're funding appropriately, adequately, and not overfunding, as you'll see in some of those examples. So my hope today is that you leave here with a better understanding of these requirements, maybe clear up some misconceptions, and then really that you can save your association money when it comes to what you need to be putting in your reserves. Because with this information, you'll be able to have a better idea of really what is the bare minimum, what is required, and what is appropriate to put into our structural reserves. So that's going to be powerful information. So what is a reserve study? A reserve study, we're looking at, the first thing is that we need to have the right inputs. And we need to identify what components our association maintain. A regular reserve study, a structural reserve study, is not going to ask you to prepare funding for any item that is not the association's expense to bear. So I start with this because this is kind of the very beginning. We need to have the right information at the beginning so that our outputs are accurate. And so there's a 3-part test from CAI which is has national reserve study standards. And essentially the components need to meet these three criteria in order to be considered a reserve component. Now, the statute for SIRS is very clear about what are your structural integrity components. They list them out, they enumerate them. But when it comes to before SIRS or any items that are not listed specifically in the statute, how do we determine what's a reserve component and what's not? So this is what we use. So the item has to be association responsibility. It needs to have a reasonably anticipated replacement schedule, and the cost needs to be able to be reasonably estimated. So if it meets those three criteria, we can potentially deem it as a reserve component that we would want to prepare and include in our reserve funding schedule. The reserve study process is important that we understand this, because when they created the structural integrity reserve study, it basically said it's a reserve study on these components. So everything I'm going to talk to you about right now about reserve studies also applies to structural reserve studies. And it really is made up of two parts. The reserve study, or the SIRS, has a physical analysis, and then that's followed by a financial analysis in that order. And the physical analysis is where we're getting all of those inputs. So when we give you a funding plan and tell you what you need to be putting in your reserves, how do we know that's the right number? It's because we're doing all of this due diligence during the physical analysis. We're classifying the property, so going through that three-part test. What are your reserve components? We're quantifying everything. We're measuring everything on site firsthand. And then we're evaluating the observable condition to determine the remaining useful life of those components. And then we come up with future cost estimates for those repairs or those replacements, whose timing we are able to schedule according to the observable condition. So it really gives us a good snapshot, a good estimate into what capital expenses are coming up, when they're going to occur, and what a reasonable cost is for those expenses. That's all done on site. And it's really important that that's done on site, because the timing of those expenses is based on the observable condition. So we're not going to say, well, an asphalt shingle roof lasts X number of years, so that's when you're going to need to do your roofs next. But a good reserve study is going to look at your roofs and say, well, based on the condition that we see, given the age, given the history of maintenance, given the history of repairs, given the material, given where it's located, all of this information we take into consideration to say, okay, X number of years is the remaining useful life, to give you an appropriate timing for that future project. Once we have all of that information, then we look at the financial analysis. That's where we're saying, okay, what do we need to put into our reserves? And it has to go in that order. So before there was mandatory SIRS funding, reserves, some associations were doing it backwards, just to put it frankly. And they would say, well, what do we have left in our budget? Let's put that in our reserves. Or what could we comfortably afford? Or what have we always done? And so they would back into it. But you have to let those inputs from the physical analysis determine what the outputs are. That's the only way you're going to make sure you have accurate reserve contributions. So the board member that calls me up and says, hey, you know, this is the makeup of my association, how much should I have in my reserves? I can't confidently answer that question for anyone until I've done a physical analysis and have all of those inputs. It's also important to understand the correlation between the inputs in the physical analysis and the output of the financial analysis, because we need to understand that if we have good information at the beginning, then we'll have the right outputs. So we have to put our time in on the front end. And a lot of times this surprises people, but the financial analysis is generally one of the easiest parts of the study, because all of the information we got on the physical analysis just tells us what the funding needs to be. We just know when items need to be done, what the cost is, and then we offset those with inflows or contributions to your reserves. So that's the reserve study process in a nutshell. Why do reserves matter? I could speak for, I have an hour that I could speak just on the benefits of reserves. And I think the most obvious one is that by funding our reserves, we're helping to avoid special assessments or loans. Two other funding sources for capital projects, but the ideal funding source, and really the way that this has been designed to work, is we pay it out of our reserves on stable, equitable contributions. So everybody is paying their fair share over time. You guys all know, if you've ever been through a special assessment or had to get a loan, the costs, the time cost, the burden that comes along with that. And at the end of the day, it's not really equitable, because depending on who's living there at that moment, they're paying for the entire replacement of that component or that entire project, even if they just moved into the community or they lived there for 20 years and just moved out and happened to miss that bill. So reserves are a much more equitable way of funding those capital projects, and you make sure the money's there and you are earning a return on that money. Generally, we keep our reserves in accounts that earn an interest, and so we're actually earning money on our reserves. So it's a very strategic way of funding our projects. Reserves will help preserve the appearance of the community. If the money is there to do the projects when they need to be done, the community is just a nicer place to live. It's standing tall. The amenities are functioning, and it's just a better place to live. The reserve study provides guidance or alignment on projects. This is something that comes up all the time. The association is not run by one person. It's usually a multi-member board, and people have different opinions and different plans. And if you don't have a single North Star that's guiding the strategic direction for the association, it's not going to be a very efficient way to run that association. So the reserve study is a way to say, okay, as a board, this is our agreed upon plan for the future, and we all agree that this is the direction that we're moving. So it gives you that good alignment. It also gives you confidence on what you should be spending your reserves on and when. So one problem is not having the money in reserves, but another problem is when we have money in reserves and we are just afraid to spend it because we don't know what we should be spending it on. The worst thing that anyone wants to do is spend money on a particular project and then in hindsight realize, oh man, we really should have waited and used that on something else because that was more pressing in the near term. A reserve study is going to give you that long-term plan where we can easily prioritize and identify what those near-term needs are. It's going to keep the community safe and viable, especially when it comes to these structural reserves in multi-story buildings. It's going to protect the investment. One thing I don't have in here about why reserves matter is when it comes to protecting the investment of the units, it's also going to help buying and selling units in the community. And reserves are much more recognizable and more of a topic of conversation than ever before, given what's happened in the new requirements. I've had realtors come up to me and say, when we're buying units or selling units, that the reserve study always is coming up now. And if the reserves aren't funded properly, then it's going to be more difficult to sell the unit. And so you're just doing your residents a disservice if you don't have properly funded reserves. It's going to reduce the cost of maintenance, certainly fulfill the board's fiduciary duty to the association by relying on a third-party objective professional to guide them in their financial plan moving forward. And then finally, I think the reason why we're all here today is compliance. There's statutes and requirements in Florida and other states as well that just regulate and require certain types of reserves and funding of reserves. So reserves are extremely important. And speaking of compliance, let's talk about what some of those requirements are. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start with the existing statutes because this is nothing new. Since 1984, condos have been subject to Florida Statute 718 that requires them to prepare a reserve schedule that is fully funded and includes roofs, painting, paving, and any other expense over $10,000. So if you've been in the industry for any amount of time, you've probably heard that before: roofs, painting, paving, and anything over $10,000. And that's been around since 1984. And for condos, reserves are statutorily restricted. They must be used for the intended purpose. So if I'm collecting money for reserves, and I'm collecting that money and the intent of that money is for our roofs, or the intent of that money is for our paving, that money can only be used for those specific components unless you get a membership vote to unrestrict those funds. And it used to be, this is crossed out here because they've recently changed this for all condos, not just 3 stories. So if you're in a 1 or 2 story condo, a lot of this SIRS stuff that we'll talk about later doesn't apply to you because the SIRS requirement is for 3 stories or higher. But this will apply to you, which is that to unrestrict reserve funds that are statutorily restricted, you need to have a majority of the total voting interests in order to achieve that. That's the vote now. So the bar has been raised. It used to be a majority of a quorum, which could have been a much smaller group. Now it's a majority of the total voting interest to waive or partially fund or unrestrict those reserves. And that's for all condos, regardless of the number of stories. And this is what associations have been doing since 1984, waiving reserves. And it's a pretty easy vote to get. You just tell the membership, hey, this is what we should be putting into our reserves, but we have the ability to waive that. We just need the majority of you to agree to it. And nobody really wants to pay more. That's human nature. And so it's been a very easy vote to get. Probably the easiest one is to waive those reserves. And so, you've heard the story countless times, kicking the can down the road and saving that for the next person, or I'm not going to be here when that needs to be replaced. I don't have to worry about that. And so we've kind of been digging ourselves into a hole, making what was manageable become unmanageable over time. And the statute requires that if you're going to waive reserves or partially fund the reserves, that you need to include this disclaimer in your financial schedule, which says waiving of reserves in whole or in part may result in unit owner liability for payment of unanticipated special assessments regarding those items. That's a no-brainer. If we don't fund it out of reserves, the money has to come from somewhere else, and it's likely going to be a special assessment to the owners. So why change? I mean, it's very obvious what the event was that rocked our industry when we had the building collapse in Surfside. I've driven by that site, and it's very sobering to think about what actually transpired on that day. And there had to be some type of a response. And I've heard the senators who wrote the bill speak on this, and their response when it came to reserves was that we need to protect associations by making sure that they have the funding that they need to keep these multi-story buildings structurally safe and structurally sound. And before, all reserves were kind of created equal. So with 718 since 1984, the association got the membership vote to waive funding their reserves, and that's all their reserves. So they could waive the swimming pool, they could waive the parking lot, they could waive all of that, those discretionary items, but they could also waive the critical structural items as well. And so the intent with this legislation was why they felt the need to create this structural reserve is that not all reserves are the same. We don't care if you waive an item that is discretionary or an amenity or something that's not going to impact the safety and the well-being of your residents. Sure, the board, should have the ability to do that if they get the member vote. But there's some reserves that we don't want them to have the ability to waive. It's not safe for them to have the ability to waive. And so that's why we now are living in a world for condos 3 stories or higher, where we have 2 separate reserves. We have non-structural waivable reserves, which we've always had. And now we have these itemized structural components that we need to fund separately, that the funding of which is completely unwaivable. I don't care if you get 100% of the member vote, you cannot waive the funding of these structural reserves. So why change? Stop delaying. The ability to waive the reserves, all the reserves, was putting future boards in an impossible position. Over time, like I said, what was once manageable just became exasperated and became unmanageable. There was no independent inspections required. One thing that you didn't see in 718 was the requirement to have an independent third party do a reserve study. Well, the association had to and has to prepare the reserve schedule. Before the SIRS, there was really no requirement of where that information came from, each of those components, to get a useful life and a cost, and do whatever they want on the back of the napkin. As long as they had some sort of information, it was really on the board to put together that schedule. And so these buildings were not getting these independent inspections. Another change was that a lot of components were out of sight, out of mind. So reserve studies historically would ignore these items, that because a reserve study inspection, according to the national standards, is a non-invasive visual inspection. So there's items that we just can't see because we're not doing destructive testing. We're not knocking down walls to look at pipes. And so there wasn't a agreed upon approach for how we handle those components. Some firms were including them, others were not. And so a lot of reserve studies, a lot of associations were getting reserve studies that were silent on some of these critical components that they should really have some funds set aside for, simply because of the fact that they couldn't be visually assessed in that non-invasive inspection. And then fourth was really to tighten control of where boards can spend reserve funds to pull out those structural items. So I think that in retrospect, by creating the structural reserve account and itemizing those structural components, it was kind of a very sensible approach, because the alternative would be, well, we need boards to have healthy reserves because it's important to the building safety, so you can't waive reserves anymore. And that would have been a little bit extreme. So in order to have the ability to still waive the items that aren't critical to our structure of our building, now we're living in this post-SIRS world where we have two separate reserve accounts. Does make things a little bit more challenging, which is why it's important to invest time to learn this information so we can put it into practice. So what changed? Well, with SB4D, they created the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, which was basically a study of the reserve funds required for the major repair and replacement of the condominium cooperative property. So that definition comes from 718. Who needs a structural integrity reserve study? Residential condos, 3 stories or greater, and it needs to be done every 10 years. So it's a 10-year reporting cycle that's written into the law right now. What you don't see here is any information about proximity to a coastline. That used to be a thing with the milestone inspections, which I believe they've done away with as well. But there's still some misconception out there. So let me just set the record straight. For a SIRS, it doesn't matter where you are in relation to a coastline. The other thing that you don't see on here for who needs a SIRS is anything about the age of the building, which is also a very common misconception, because the sister inspection, the milestone, it takes into account the age of the building. That's a qualifier for if and when you need the milestone inspection. Regardless of the age of your building, if your residential condo 3 stories or greater, you must have a SIRS done. Okay, so if you didn't know that, that's a great nugget to leave with today. If you have a newer building and you thought that, well, we're new, we don't need the SIRS, that is not the case. So what's included in our SIRS? The statute makes it very clear. It itemizes these components. They call out the roof, they call out the structure, including primary structural systems, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows and exterior doors, and then any other expense over $10,000, failure to maintain or replace negatively affects any item listed in above in those subparagraphs A through G. So that doesn't mean that any item over $10,000, that's another point of confusion. That's any item over $10,000 that is related to or would negatively impact A through G. So the items in orange here, where you see structure, exterior doors, those are revisions to the original 4D. So those have been added afterwards. So this is the most up-to-date list. You might see something where it mentions the floor and the foundation, or it doesn't mention exterior doors. That's outdated information. This is the most recent here, and these are the items that are included. So we've had some clarification of the asset list. We're a few years now since the original creation of the SIRS, and a lot of the questions or the misinterpretations have been since clarified. And one thing is that if an asset is maintained by another entity, not the association's expense to bear, the association does not need to include it. This is really important, because I still to this day get calls all the time where people are concerned that windows is on the list of SIRS components, because now they have to fund for their windows, but the association doesn't maintain the windows. I can tell you now confidently that if the association does not maintain the component, it does not need to be included in your SIRS. You will not prepare your financial analysis with that component included. That goes for any other component that's not association responsibility that may happen to be on that list. Assets with long lifespans. This one came up too quite a bit. There's items listed like your primary structural system that has a very long lifespan, and if you're never going to completely replace that. And so they've since clarified that if the life of the asset remaining is greater than 25 years, then it does not have to be funded for the complete replacement in the SIRS. There's a clarifier there that the study may recommend a deferred maintenance expense amount for such item. So while we may not be replacing, preparing for the complete replacement of a structural column, there may be a deferred maintenance expense related to that. So if there's a crack or some damage, you might need to do a concrete restoration or something like that. So it's a more sensible approach. But those were probably the two biggest questions or concerns that came up when they first said, okay, you need to do a SIRS. These are the components, and it had windows and it had foundation. All of a sudden, associations are thinking, okay, we're going to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that we're saving up for to completely replace our building's foundation, to completely replace all of the windows that aren't association responsibility. So you can breathe a sigh of relief if you still thought that was the case, because it's not the case. Long lifespans may have a deferred maintenance expense, but not the complete replacement. So who can perform a SIRS? There's 4 designations, professional designations, that are authorized to perform or verify the inspection for a SIRS. That would be a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida, a licensed architect, a RS, a reserve specialist, or a PRA, a professional reserve analyst. And those are the 4 professional designations that are authorized to do these SIRS, to verify or inspect, to verify or complete the inspection. And this is important because there's a lot of gray area when it comes to this SIRS stuff. And they were very careful to make sure that the folks that are authorized to be doing these studies on behalf of associations have the experience and expertise to be able to give professional guidance that is appropriate. So it's not black and white. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, which is why it's so important that these properly designated individuals are working on these studies. A SIRS must be conducted by December 31st of 2024. Hear this: if you have not had your SIRS, if you don't have it under contract or you don't have it scheduled, you must have it done before the end of this year. I can tell you personally, Reserve Advisors is scheduling now for September inspections, October reports. So we're getting closer and closer to that deadline. Can also tell you that there's other firms in the industry that are completely booked for 2024 already. So this is the proverbial 11th hour, which is crazy because we're not even in June yet. But there's always been this concern with the imbalance of supply and demand. There's only so many of those 4 designations in the state, and there's only so many that reserve studies that they can do. And there's X number of condos that are 3 stories or higher that need these SIRS. And they added the reserve designations in the bill in 2.0 to try and put more supply into that, which has helped, but there's still an imbalance there. So it's going to be in your best interest to get this thing on the books, get it scheduled sooner than later. And then for developers, the turnover inspection report has been updated to align with the SIRS and is conducted in lieu of the SIRS. So when they passed 4D, it originally said that that turnover you had to do a SIRS. They've clarified that with 2.0, and that you don't have to do the SIRS, just the turnover inspection, but it has been aligned more closely with the SIRS. What are your reserves allowed to be spent on? Basically, just like 718, you have to use the reserves for their intended purpose. And when it comes to SIRS, unless you get the member vote, that's gone. You can't get the member vote is meaningless with funding your SIRS. So we're collecting this money. The intended purpose is for our structural components that were called out in our SIRS, and that money must be used for our structural reserve components. And the SIRS funding. So this is a question that's come up now that associations are getting their SIRS back. When does the mandatory funding take place where we can't waive? And there's also a misconception here that I'd like to just clarify. There's a common belief that you don't actually have to start funding according to your SIRS until your 2026 budget. which is partly true, but I put an asterisk there because the law gives the association the ability to not fund the SIRS in 2025, but you don't just automatically get to skip funding your SIRS, your structural reserves in 25. You have to obtain the proper membership vote to do so. So you kind of have this buffer year for 25. So when you're working on your budget this year, you can get the membership vote and not fund your SIRS completely. After that, so now we're looking at doing our budget next year for 2026. Member vote is meaningless, and those reserves must be funded exactly according to our structural reserve study. So if you hear people say, oh, you don't have to actually fund your structural reserves until 2026 budget, partly true, but you can't just skip 25 as a board decision. You need a membership vote if you're going to waive or partially fund your structural reserves in 25. Alternative. So the statute mentioned an alternative to getting a SIRS and funding your structural reserves accordingly. And everybody, when they saw this, got excited. They thought this was the loophole that they've all been waiting for. Just to set the record straight, the alternative is basically if you operate a multi-condominium of at least 25 condominiums, and it's reasonably expected to satisfy the association's reserve funding obligations by the allocation of funds in the annual operating budget. This was carved in there because there's a handful of associations, and some of which I believe are in the senators' voting districts, that this is how they've been doing things. They don't fund the reserves. They just have a very healthy, clearly defined operating budget where they fund these reserve projects, capital projects, and they're multi-condominiums. So I can probably count on one hand how many associations this applies to. This is not your way out. This is not the loophole. For the majority, 99.9% of three-story condos, you're going to need the SIRS, unless that applies. So if you are a three-story or higher condo and you're subject to the SIRS requirement, you can waive your non-structural reserves. So any item that is not A through G, 25, 26, 27, you can continue to waive with, remember, now it's a higher bar, a majority vote of the total voting interest of the membership. So anything that's not called out in your structural integrity reserve. And a perfect example, elevators. So believe it or not, elevators are not called out as a structural integrity component. So their funding would not be mandatory and unwaivable. They would be part of your non-structural or your general reserve funding. So there's other items that meet the 718 requirement, roofs, painting, paving, and anything over $10,000, which is still in place. And for those items that aren't structural and over 10,000, you can waive. For 1 to 2 story condos, you can still waive your reserves, including anything that might be a structural component, your roofs, those items. If you're 1, 2 stories, as of right now, you can continue to waive those if you get the proper membership vote with majority of the voting interest. We've also clarified that you can adjust for inflation, which is great because we strongly believe that if you're doing a long-term forecast of expenses and funding, that you should definitely have an inflationary factor in there. Otherwise, you have to update your study every single year to account for those adjustments. And with a 10-year requirement, if you don't have inflation built in, you're going to be really out of whack real quick with your funding. The reserves and insurance premiums, which you may or may not know, are not included when determining if the budget has increased more than 115%. So if you think that you can wait, not fund reserves, and this is kind of going to be your protection against getting your reserves up to adequate funding or where they really need to be, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, but in the best interest of the association and the members, the reserve contributions and your insurance premiums are excluded from that calculation. So that is not going to insulate you from having to increase your structural reserves. The statute is very clear that if you are subject to a SIRS, meaning you're a 3-story condo or higher, that ignoring the statutory requirement is a breach of your fiduciary duty. They say that, if you fail to complete the structural integrity reserve study, it's a breach of an officer and director's fiduciary relationship to the association. So this is something that they're taking very seriously. It holds board members to a higher standard. There's that liability there. The moral of the story is if you need to get a SIRS, get a SIRS, because you're not doing yourself or anyone any favors by ignoring what the requirement is. A few FAQs from the DBPR. So the DBPR is the Department of Business and Professional Regulation here in Florida, and they have a division of condos and co-ops and timeshares. It's been a leading resource when it comes to really all things related to condos, HOAs in the state of Florida. And the statutes, these new requirements, are overseen and enforced on paper by the DBPR. And they're an important organization when it comes to how our association is going to be cited for this if they don't comply. What does compliance look like? All of this information beyond just the word of the law, where we're talking to putting it into practice, we look to the DBPR as a resource. Is the pooling method of maintaining reserves still permissible? This question comes up all the time. And I've been in a room where 50% of the people say that you can't pool your SIRS reserves, and the other 50% say that you can. The DBPR has said, yes, you can pool your SIRS reserves. Pool meaning rather than having individual reserve accounts for each structural component, we're going to take all of those structural components as a pool of assets, and we're going to fund those with the pooled method of funding or a cash flow type of an analysis. DBPR agrees that pooling is permissible. I just watched a recording of a town hall with Senator Pizzo and Senator Bradley, where Senator Bradley says, yes, you can pool your structural reserves. So just wanted to make that clear, make sure that we were giving you accurate information there. Another question that the DBPR was posed with is, must an association's reserve account have accumulated all of the funds necessary to account for the remaining useful life for each reserve component by 2025? And this is where they say, whether the full amount must be accumulated by 25 depends on the recommendation of the SIRS and the reserve needs of the association. This may or may not require full reserve funding by 2025. I like this answer because what I was alluding to earlier is they've called out 4 professional designations that can be doing these things. And an answer like this says, let the professionals be the professionals. We're going to rely on what their report says, and it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the specific reserve needs of the association. And so that just shows that I think the importance of making sure that whoever you're partnering with on your structural reserve study really knows this inside and out, because there's that gray area where if you get 3 different structural integrity reserve studies, you're going to have 3 very different reports and recommendations likely. Not a huge deal of consistency because they're letting the professionals be the professionals. So this is my favorite part, and this is where I'm going to save you some money. And we're going to talk about best practices for implementation. Now we know, we've listened, we know the process. We know what components we're going to be funding for that we can't waive, and we know when that starts and the timing of that with our budget. So let's make sure that we're not doing our owners a disservice by not properly funding our reserves. And when I say properly, I'm not necessarily even talking about a shortfall. I'm also talking about the other side of the coin where we might be overfunding our reserves and overburdening our owners. So we first have to look at the funding goals of a reserve study. And I've got 4 here that I wanted to talk about. The first is full funding. And this is a very important distinction and one that there's a lot of confusion about. But what we're talking about, what the statute requires, is a fully funded reserve budget. Reserve budget, meaning that our reserve budget is on a path that we're not going to run out of money or be at risk of special assessment over time in the future. What we're talking about here in number 1 for the full funding is a fully funded balance, a fully funded reserve balance. That is just a calculation of how what our reserve balance is for a particular component compared to what the replacement is for that component. And there's some schools of thought where the funding objective is to achieve this fully funded reserve balance. Well, the statute doesn't require a fully funded reserve balance. They only require a fully funded reserve budget. That's an important distinction. And you'll see why that's very important in just a second here. Another funding goal for a reserve study is threshold funding. Now, threshold funding is a cash flow type of an analysis, which means that once we identify all of the expenses, when they're going to occur and what the costs are, then we offset those expenses over time with inflows to the reserve contributions that are strategic, and make sure that we never fall below a certain amount of money in our reserves. And our reserve studies are 30 years. And so a threshold funding plan would say, okay, well, in the next 30 years, the years where we're spending the most money out of our reserves, where we have the largest projects that we're doing, let's make sure that we're going to prepare to find a funding plan where your reserves aren't going to go below some sort of a predetermined threshold. That is threshold funding. It's a type of a cash flow analysis. The third is baseline funding, which is really easy because it's threshold funding with no threshold. The threshold is 0. So rather than leaving some sort of a preset threshold in that critical year or years, we're just making sure that our reserves are always cash positive over the span of the study. And as long as we do that, we're baseline funding our reserves. And this is where I think is one of the most powerful pieces of information is number 4, that there's a statutory funding goal, which is we're funding to meet a state requirement. In the state of Florida, any of the other 3 funding goals are currently acceptable, which means that, sure, we can achieve a 100% funded reserve balance. That's acceptable. We could also threshold fund our reserves or even baseline fund our reserves, and it would still be statutorily acceptable. And that goes for 718, and that also goes for 4D and 154 in our structural integrity reserves as well. So what that means is that the question comes up, and the statute, unfortunately, does not do a very good job of wording this or communicating this. In fact, the DBPR is still learning this, and I'll share that with you at the end here about an educational opportunity that's coming up. But the bare minimum for your structural reserve funding is baseline funding. That question always comes up. You know, we're stretched so thin. We've got these increases here, these increases there. We just want to meet the requirement. What is the bare minimum that we can fund in our structural reserves? That is going to be a baseline funded cash flow analysis. So let's look at a couple examples of those funding goals, those funding objectives, and see how those impact our contributions to our reserves. So let me break down this graph for you if you've never seen it before, or if you just need a quick refresher. Don't be overwhelmed if you don't like math or numbers or graphs. I'm going to make it real easy for you. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So there's 3 main components to this graph. Our time is going across the x-axis. So as time passes, we're going across there. And then our reserve balance is the y-axis. So how much money do we have in our reserve account? The blue line is our year-end reserve balance. So at the end of each year, that's the amount of money that we should have in our reserves. The red bars going down over time are our expenditures. Those are the projects that have been identified during the reserve study. The bigger the bar, the lower they go, the higher magnitude cost. So those are the expenses over time. And then the green bars going upwards are the recommended reserve contributions. That's the question that we get from all those inputs that say, if you put this much into your reserves, this is how much you should be funding. So let's look at just kind of the givens here. So if you remember, like trigonometry, I think, or geometry, we have our givens. These are going to stay the same across all the funding examples I'm going to show you. And just to illustrate that, all things being equal, as long as if we change our funding goal or our objective, then we really have a major impact on our contribution. So let's say we've got a 130 unit condo here. It's 28 years old, and they have a starting reserve of 1.1 million, and they're 38% funded with $5 million of expenses over the next 20 years, and they're currently funding $190,000 into their reserves. Come out there, do a structural reserve study, and we're going to look at probably the most extreme funding level, and we're going to say, well, let's get you to a fully funded balance, this 100% funded number, and let's do that in 2 years. So if we go from where we're at now to 100% funded balance in 2 years, that's going to be an increase of $577 for all of these 130 unit owners per month to achieve that 100% funded balance in 2 years compared to where we're at right now. When the SIRS requirements came out, there were a lot of associations concerned with, items that aren't association responsibility, long-lived components, big ticket items, and then they are getting a plan like this, and they're in their minds, they're imagining that this is what they need to do to meet the statutory requirement. And that's where I think a lot of the concern was, and I'd say panic isn't even an exaggeration. It was, the sky is falling. Our owners can't afford $577 more per month for their reserves. There will be associations that, even if they take the most, aggressive approach with their reserves and do like a baseline plan, it's still going to be quite an increase because they've been putting off funding their reserves. They have older buildings, they have more near-term, higher dollar types of projects. But generally speaking, we can help ease that burden by being smart about the funding. And what I mean by that is, this is your 2-year example to get to 100% funded balance. If we take 5 years to get to that 100% funded balance, we buy ourselves a little bit more time, so our contribution is not so extreme, and our increase goes down to $269 per month per unit owner. Remember, all things being equal, all we're doing is just changing our funding objective here, which is to achieve this 100% funded balance in 5 years. Let's take a look at threshold funding. All things being equal, this is a threshold funding plan. Professionally reserve advisors, this is our professional recommendation. Well, you can statutorily do a baseline plan. We feel like it's in the best interest of an association to have that threshold in that critical year. So what we're seeing here is the same components of the graph, but our reserve balance is a balance between, spending our reserves and then saving some reserves, and then spending and saving. And so we're just balancing our cash in with our cash out. And it's based on the context of the expenses. So we make sure that before we have a big expense, that we're building up our reserves so that when we spend that money, we still stay above this threshold in that threshold year, that critical year. This is really important because if we go back, there's one thing I want to point out here is, if you're following this plan to get to a 100% funded reserve balance, in 20 years from now, you're going to have about $3.5 million just sitting in your reserve account. And we're basically ignoring the context of the expenditures and just building up our reserve money because we want to achieve this 100% balance. But like I said, we have $3.5 million sitting in our reserves in 20 years that we don't need. As a board member, property manager, even as a reserve professional, it's really hard to justify to the members why we need $3.5 million sitting in our reserves in 20 years. And the reason is because you don't. This is an overfunded reserve plan. Sure, it's very conservative, but too extreme, especially if you've got something's got to give. This is not the place to add insult to injury with this reserve funding. So, also not to mention, if we have $3.5 million just sitting in our reserves, that's a risk of fraud or that money not being used properly. There's just a lot of reasons why you don't want that much money just sitting in your reserves. So if we go back to this threshold plan, we don't have that problem. We're not just building up our reserves to hit this high number and have this fat balance, but these are adequately funded reserves that are going to prepare us for the projects that are coming up when they need to happen. And what the members are really going to appreciate is, look at our reserve contributions. They're stable. So we can have stable, equitable inflows to our reserves and weather these expenses that are going to vary and make sure that our reserves never fall below a certain threshold. And then like the mic drop moment is look at the increase, $29 per unit owner per month to go to a threshold funded plan and be able to fund $5 million of expenses over the 20 years. Statutorily compliant, because remember, we can threshold fund, we can baseline fund. Now, if you wanted to fund the bare minimum, which is probably lower than we would recommend, just as for illustrative purposes, this is what it would look like. And the threshold year where we have that major project is we don't really have that threshold anymore. Our reserves get pretty close to zero there, and it's an $8 increase per unit owner per month. One other thing in these examples is you can see in the threshold plan, our percent funded of our reserve balance goes from 38% to 20% in that critical year to 28%. A lot of folks would say, oh man, you need to have your reserve balance above 70% or you're at risk of special assessment. But you can clearly see in this plan here that we're not at risk of special assessment at all throughout the 20 years. In fact, we've identified all of our expenses and we have a built-in threshold. So an example, looking at a threshold funding and calling out the specific percent funded kind of shows that maybe percent funded is not the right funding objective, and we can consider a different approach that's going to help us be more strategic with funding according to the context and the timing of our expenditures, rather than just achieving a percent number. Even in this baseline funding example, our reserve balance, our percent funded gets very low throughout the plan, but still, technically speaking, there is no special assessment on the horizon there, but probably do want to have more of a threshold. So why is this information important? This is important because you're going to go to some professional firm, or you already have, and get a SIRS done. And then they're going to give you the output. They're going to give you a funding plan, and they're going to give you that number. And they're going to say, this is how much you need to be putting in your reserves. And before today, you may not have understood different funding objectives or realized that there were different options available, or that the statute doesn't require you to be 100% funded reserve balance, that a reserve budget can be fully funded. And so over time, as long as the money's there when you need it, you're statutorily compliant. That's why I say that this is going to save you money, because I guarantee you, out of all the folks, the 183 folks in this room today, some of you are looking at funding plans in your SIRS that look a lot like this and a lot like this, and you're trying to figure out how in the world we're going to do that. Or you're working on your SIRS right now, and there's some funding recommendations that are coming. Now you're more informed. You can ask your SIRS provider, hey, which funding objective are we doing here? Is this threshold, or are we achieving a balance here? Can we go lower? Does the statute allow that? Because, you know, we'd like to do this, or, you know, we're familiar with this. So I think the knowledge is power when it comes to this reserve funding stuff. The statute doesn't tell you this. They allude to it, but they've kind of left it to the reserve professionals and the DBPR to work out all of the details. So hopefully you found that helpful. I know that we'll be sharing the slides with you too, so you can follow these funding examples, share it with others. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you guys have. As far as the next steps, we already kind of talked about this. Don't delay. There's the supply and the demand is still not equal, and there's more demand than there's supply. Like I said, we're booked till September, October right now. Other firms, all their 24 spots are already booked. So get this done sooner than later. It's not going anywhere. Some associations want to know, well, there's not a reserve study police. How are they going to enforce this? How are they going to know if we don't do our SIRS? No way they could, you know, knock on every association's door and ask to see our SIRS. Truthfully, the DBPR are the ones that are responsible for enforcing this. And they have historically had resources and staff that wasn't adequate to handle something like this. The town hall with the senators, they were saying that in one of the last legislative sessions, they included a lot more money and resources for the DBPR. So that's going to help. But I don't think the DBPR is going to become the reserve study police knocking on your door. But what we're going to see, and what we're already seeing to a great extent, is that if you are required to get a SIRS and you don't have a SIRS, it's going to be very hard to do business as an association. And I'm sure that the business partners that are sponsoring this call would agree, if they're dealing in this space, if you're going to get insurance policy, if you're trying to get a loan, if you're trying to buy or sell a unit in the condo, and they know you're a 3-story condo and you need to have a SIRS, and you don't have a SIRS, it's going to be a major red flag. And so it's going to very quickly come to light that you're not meeting your requirement and the board is not fulfilling their fiduciary duty. So no, the reserve study police are probably not going to knock on your door, but you can't hide this very long. And like I said, I think a good way to put it is it's going to be very hard to do business as an association if you're required to get a SIRS and you just don't meet that requirement. And so you want to prepare for your funding adjustments. You know, whether you're doing a baseline plan or trying to achieve a 100% balance in 2 years, adjustments are coming. There's going to be some pain for older buildings that have not been diligently funding their reserves or getting reserve studies. And so we want to just start preparing for that. And transparency is going to be key. Education is key. Communication is key. You know, we don't want to force this down anybody's throat, but we want to just kind of lay it out and let our members see that this is not only what's required, but it's for the greater good. And us as boards, as managers, we're doing everything that we can to mitigate any sort of increases. As reserve professionals, we're very sensitive to any sort of increases in your funding. We realize that, you know, behind every number is a human being, is a family that we're asking for them to give up more of their money. So we need to be good stewards of the association's funds. And that's also why I think it's so important to understand this reserve funding and some strategy behind that, so that we're enabled to do that. And make sure that you're going to partner with professionals that will help you engage the community and communicate the findings and options. I do this day in and day out, and I'm still learning all the time. Still don't have it all figured out. And if this is just one of the many things on your plate as a board member or a manager, man, these are going to be some difficult conversations to have if you don't have some professional help giving you that guidance. So just make sure, you know, we're always here to help. That's everything that I wanted to cover. I did want to mention that, which I think is kind of illustrates how this is all being put into practice with the DBPR, is on June 4th, we are doing a SIRS and reserve study funding educational course for the general public that we're partnering with the DBPR on. And so I'll make sure that that information is shared with you. It's kind of hard to find, but you know, when people are asking, you know, funding questions about the SIRS, and we're really getting into the details like we did today, we're relying on the DBPR to know what the heck any of this is. And we're the ones that they've tapped to train the general public on this, and ultimately train the DBPR on this too. So just because they say that they're the ones that oversee reserve studies doesn't mean they know a whole lot about reserve studies. And so this is one step to equipping them and the general public on knowing more about this reserve funding stuff, because it's so important, and the statute does not really clarify any of that. They've kind of left it to the professionals. So we're excited for that event. Hopefully you can mark your calendars and join us. We'll make sure that we get a link to you, throw it in the chat, and I'm sure Peggy will be able to follow up as well. And that's everything that I wanted to cover today on the SIRS. So I appreciate your time, and happy to stick around for questions too, and take a look at some of the ones that have come through. So I'll turn it back over to Ms. West.
Thank you, Nick. Awesome information. And I love the way you present it, where you can understand it easily, I think. And everyone getting a copy of these slides is going to be very helpful to refer back to as they meet with their architects and engineers and so on. So we do have a few questions, 15 of them actually. I'll try to go through them. Some of them you answered along the way, but just to start, we've got the first one from Edward. He says, what can you tell me is the minimum reserves that you must pay for a co-op? Now, I guess you have to go through the exercise and figure that out. I don't think co-ops are any different than condos, right?
So that's a good question. I don't do a whole lot of co-ops. It's mostly been condos, and I know that the statute calls out residential condominiums. So I would have to look into that. what the specific requirements are for co-ops, but if you're asking for the minimum payment, if we're talking about, you know, a condo, then the minimum would be that baseline funded plan that we talked about.
Okay, so I'll note his name and try to pull that out after the webinar. The next one is, do you ever include elevators in a SIRS? I think you mentioned that, but want to review that?
Yeah, so when we do our SIRS, we look at the non-structural reserve components as well, because I think it's important that if we're looking at a long-term plan, that the board has full visibility and the full funding picture. If the question is, are we including them in the structural category of non-waivable reserves? No, because they're not called out as a structural component. So those would not be unwaivable. Those would be in your general or non-structural reserves, which, you know, you may feel one way or the other about it, but the statute does not call out elevators as a structural component.
Okay, the next question, I don't think you mentioned, but they're asking, is SIRS study not needed for an office condo, but a reserve study is needed for an office condo?
Oh, that's a good question. So the SIRS is needed for residential condos. So I don't believe you would need a SIRS, but a office condo, non-residential, would still be subject to 718, which would mean that you don't necessarily need to have a professional reserve study, but you still would be subject to those reserve requirements, but preparing the reserve schedule, fully funding it unless you get the member vote and so on.
Okay. It says, please comment on waterproofing of the lanai concrete floors. Our association is required to remove the flooring to waterproof the floor, or are there alternatives to this expensive approach that doesn't seem to make reasonable sense?
James, I think that would be kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on, that's one of those gray areas, depending on what the firm's professional opinion is. There's not really a one-size-fits-all to that. I know that we have a specific approach that we would take, you know, depending on what we see and what we think would be appropriate.
Okay. Joseph is asking, it says our insurance company is demanding that we get a new roof in order for them to cover us for this year. We just had our roof recertified and it shows we are good for 5 more years. What can we do in this case?
I would share that information with your reserve study provider. We always take into account any other data that's available. So when we're piecing together that remaining useful life or the timing of the project, all of that is really valuable information to have. And we can certainly consider that and have a conversation about that to come up with what would make the most sense as far as the timing. The insurance in the roofs is a very interesting thing because sometimes our engineer would come out and say, oh, you've got more life left in this roof. But we know that the market right now is going to require you to replace this roof sooner than the actual end of useful life, which we're seeing quite a bit. And so how do you handle that? That's a case-by-case thing, but we are very aware that that is out there, and making sure that our reserve plan is not only is our professional opinion, but also is going to be, you know, a useful tool in practice. You know, we could put something out for a certain useful life, but if you can't even get an insurance policy, if you keep your roof that long, then that's going to be problematic too. So it's certainly a discussion that we're having during the reserve studies, and one that will continue to keep coming up, I'm sure.
Okay. All right, the next question is to verify, is the deadline for SIRS January 1st, 2025?
Close enough. I think the statute says 12/31 of 2024.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Barry's asking, can a building contractor perform the visual inspection for SIRS? Would that be a GC or?
That's a good question. I think generally speaking, the statute says that the inspection or the SIRS must be performed or verified by one of those 4 designations. So my gut would say no, but Barry is an expert when it comes to this stuff. So maybe there is some sort of a way that could satisfy the inspection if they're not. But generally speaking, to my knowledge, if you're not one of those 4 designations we mentioned, licensed engineer, licensed architect, RS or PRA, performing or verifying the inspection, then it would not satisfy the SIRS requirement.
Okay, thank you. Did you say that in 2025, the SIRS can be partially funded?
Yes, with an asterisk. So the SIRS, if you get the proper member vote, 2025 is kind of that buffer year where they will allow you to waive or partially fund those SIRS numbers with the member vote. But in 2026, they become completely unwaivable.
Okay. All right, another question from Barry. The HB 1021 final bill analysis indicates that the pooled reserves cannot be used for cultural or structural integrity reserves. I think he's making a statement there. You said,
Which is, yeah, it's a true statement. There was an analysis done by someone who said that the pooled reserves cannot be used for structural integrity reserves. We saw the DBPR's response. I've heard it straight from the senators who wrote the bill that the pooling is acceptable.
yeah,
So that's
okay.
what we're going with. We always follow the DBPR's interpretation. We've been doing this for 30+ years in Florida. Subject to DBPR 718 reserve requirements, we've always followed their interpretation. And if they say pooling is allowed, then we're going to recommend that.
Okay. Dominic's asking, why can, at the time it's needed, have a assessment in the conjunction with the setting aside the monies for capital improvements?
I think he's talking about special assessments, which, you know, may be a very real necessity moving forward. You know, you might be so behind in your reserve funding and have such large near-term projects that there's no way you could possibly fund that out completely out of your reserves. So the idea of having a special assessment to assist with those capital needs, really looking at a combination of funding sources, I think we're going to see more and more of that. So we'll do what we can out of reserves, but there's a limit to that. And there's other sources available that we can tap into, like special assessment or a bank loan. And I think if the deficit is so extreme, then there will need to be a combination of funding sources to cover those projects.
Okay, moving down to Glenn, can you use a combination of funding methods within a plan?
Can you use a combination of funding methods within a plan? Generally, you kind of have to pick a path and stay the course. So one example is if we always recommend a cash flow analysis. We feel like that's going to give you the lowest required contribution and still protect the association. But if an association is funding restricted accounts, so component reserves, we also will give them the component funding recommendations because that's what they're currently doing. They have balances for those accounts and so on. In that case, they would be getting two recommendations. They'd be getting the component funding, which they're currently doing, and then reserve advisors would say, and here's what it would be if you switch to pooled. And so, but they would have to pick one. You can't do both simultaneously.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Jasmine, yes, we are going to share the slides. Daniel's asking in 2025, the association can waive only by a majority of the voting interest.
That is correct, Daniel. Yes.
Yep. Okay. It appears that the slides were depicting reserve studies that are pooled and not specific item expense. Clarify?
Yep, Daryl, that's also correct. Reason being is that if we're doing the itemized component reserve funding, generally is going to give us higher balances, higher required contributions, just because of the nature of how we calculate those expenses. So the idea here was we wanted to help associations explore the minimum level of funding required. And in order to do that, we had to look at a cash flow analysis.
Okay, dropping down to Barry, he's admitting that he put a trick question in there and that a building contractor can perform the visual inspection for SIRS as long as it's verified by an individual that meets one of the 4 designations. So thank you, Barry, for that.
Thank you,
Next.
Barry. Yeah, that's one I always say is that the inspection must be performed or verified. And I don't think that's common knowledge. I think a lot of people don't get that or verified. So that's a good point.
Raquel's asking, can we have one combined study combination of normal reserve study and SIRS?
You can have everything under one cover, but you would have to have two separate financial analyses because those structural reserves must be used only for structural components, and everything else has to be kept separate from the structural. So the way that we're doing it is it's one report, but we're looking at all of your reserve components, your non-structural and your structural, and keeping them financially separate. So the plan that we looked at, you'd have two separate funding plans. So you'd have a path for your non-structural and a path and a plan for your structural. So yes and no. You can have them together, but they still have to remain financially separate.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to move over to chat. There were some questions that came through there. I've got a gal here, Wanda, was just commenting. I had a condo that went 2 to 3 years with no roof coverage. They kept waiving the fully funded amount, 24 units, and they have had 2 back-to-back special assessments totaling $18,000 to $20,000 per unit. So I guess what you're telling is you can avoid that, right? Or can they take that now, I'm asking, and roll it into a new special or SIRS assessment?
I think that just illustrates that, if the reserves aren't there, the money's got to come from somewhere else. And in that example, Wanda, only 24 units, that's not a lot of people to spread it across. And so that is, 18 to 20,000 per unit is a lot of money. I guess that if they did do those roof replacements already, then that would sort of reset the clock theoretically on that component, which would mean that when we're putting together their SIRS, they're not going to have such a near-term roof replacement because they just did it. So they're going to have more time to fund up for that next cycle of the roof replacement, or really any other project. That idea of resetting the clock or getting credit for what you've done is something that comes up quite a bit in my conversations with associations, because they want to make sure that if they've been putting a lot of money into their reserves, or if they've been doing a lot of these capital projects, that's going to be considered when we're giving them future financial projections for their SIRS, which it absolutely will. Because like in Wanda's example, if it's brand new roofs, then we've got much further out until we actually need to be doing the next cycle of that project.
Okay, here's a good question. Our building is on a canal. Does a reserve study include the seawall?
Case by case. If it is close enough to the building where it could be considered structural, in that maybe anything over $10,000 that would negatively impact those structural components, I could see it go either way. I believe that even with our studies, it's gone either way, depending. You kind of have to make a judgment call there.
Well, if it's over $10,000, wouldn't it have to be included? I would think so.
It would be in their reserve study. Yeah, the judgment call would be: are we going to call it a structural unwaivable, or
yes,
is it?
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, here's a accountability question. Can the engineer who completes a SIRS and the board members of the HOA be held liable for another disaster if it occurs? And is there any discussion about that, or of, or?
We have professional standards that need to be upheld, ethical standards and moral obligations, and I think that's the reason why they've called out these designations to be doing these SIRS. I don't know how the specific liability would work, but my understanding is that no, yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question. Unfortunately,
Ask your attorney, right?
That's a good answer
That's an
too.
attorney question. Ask your attorney. Okay, here's one. Do the SIRS reports have to be sent to the DBPR? If so, does the association send it, or the company completing the report?
So I know the milestone has to be sent, submitted, but when they first came out with these requirements, I believe that it's the association. I'm not sure because we don't do milestone inspections. The reporting cycle, the reporting has changed for the SIRS. I believe that it needs to be submitted to shared with the membership, but I don't know if it necessarily needs to be reported or shared with the DBPR. I'm sure Barry knows, so Barry, feel free to chime in. But the SIRS is considered an official record of the association, and it does need to be kept on file for, I believe, 15 years. But the reporting requirements are different than the milestone inspection.
And I would definitely put a point in here for Vinteum or any company that you have your website with. This is what your website is for, storing your documents so you have them at your fingertips. And somebody asks you a question like this, a board member worried about being liable and so on, you've got this all in one fast, quick place. So I would definitely put everything into that website. Let's see. Let's see. Will a current 2023 reserve study, I don't think, help with SIRS reserve study? A 2023, would that be allowed?
It would help if, I think that if you go to the firm that did your last reserve study, they could probably get you a good deal on your structural one, since they did that so recently for you. It wouldn't satisfy the SIRS requirement. You may be able to use that inspection if it was done recently enough and the firm was comfortable doing that, and just update the financial analysis, pull out those structural components from the reserve study and make it satisfy the SIRS requirement, since it had such a recent inspection by one of those 4 designations. But that would probably be a case-by-case basis. I know for us, if we have associations that we recently inspected, like last year, and did a regular reserve study, we can make their reserve study a SIRS without coming back on site, because we performed the inspection by one of the designations in that reasonable amount of time that we're comfortable doing that. So I'm not sure if other firms take the same approach, but yeah, it would be worth exploring. I'd check with the firm that did your previous study and see if they can offer something like that.
Okay, here's a question. If budget is approved in 2024, does that defer the SIRS funding to the next year?
If budget is approved in 2024, does that defer? Not sure I follow the question there. So if you work on your budget and before you get your SIRS, because that could potentially happen, right? You do your
Right.
budget and you get your SIRS later in the year. I guess you already adopted the budget before you had the SIRS, so you wouldn't have that information available because of how the timing would work out. But yeah, that's a tough one, because I'm not sure
Yeah.
on the specifics. But if you don't have a
Meet the
SIRS and you're
deadline.
working on your budget before 12/31 and it's adopted before your SIRS results come in, no one could really expect you to use the SIRS that you don't have to set that budget.
Right. Getting lots of comments about, can you share this with the boards? Yes, absolutely. Let's see. Should a buyer be concerned if the HOA condo fee appears to be low compared to the similar aged condo building with similar number of units and amenities?
I would think it's worth looking into. Yeah, because a lot of times what would happen is that the contributions or the dues were artificially suppressed so that it would be attractive to the market. And then it's just a special assessment waiting to happen. And
Right.
realtors are well aware of that. Potential buyers are well aware of that. I guess the silver lining with all this SIRS business is you can't play that shell game anymore. This is going to even the playing field. Everyone's got to be paying their fair share for these structural reserves. So the association down the street that just wants to keep waiving reserves and keep our dues low, inappropriately so, isn't able to do that anymore. So hopefully those wild fluctuations will start to go away as the required funding gets implemented. But yeah, if you've got 2 associations very similar and one has a much lower maintenance fee, let me see the reserve study. Let me see the health of your reserves. There's something.
And the financial statements too at the time before you close. That should be open and available again. All your financial statements also on your website. So here's a question. Does pool need a vote for SIRS if we are currently using a straight line method for the non-SIRS?
The legislation does not make it explicitly clear how that works. You kind of have to use your best business judgment. If you are currently not pooling your reserves, I believe, yeah, you would need a member vote to pool your structural reserves. The general consensus is if you're already pooling your reserves, then you should be able to pool your structural reserves without the member vote. But that's a legal question. And while we can tell you high level, you know, how it all works, when you talk about actually getting that vote and moving those funds, unrestricting that money, you want to have legal counsel advising you, because it's going to be, you know, probably different for each association.
You know, if there's going to be a penalty if you don't conform to that 12/31 deadline.
I don't think that there's a very like clearly defined fine or penalty that we're aware of, but like I was saying, it's going to quickly come to light, and it's just going to make everything difficult, if not impossible, to effectively run a condo if you don't have that SIRS.
We have HOA guest here today. Says, how does this work with HOA single story community? You have to be 3 stories or higher, right, Nick?
You do, and you have to be a legal entity, has to be a condominium association. So SIRS would not apply to HOAs. Really not much of this information would. Their reserves are a little bit different. They're subject to 720, and that's a whole other conversation.
A whole nother webinar, right?
Right.
Okay, let's see, what's this one? Many HOAs have been kicking the can down the road for many years. In your best guesstimate, how many HOAs in Florida have insufficient reserves, and how will this affect the resale market going forward? You have any insight on that?
We do have some SIRS data on kind of what we're seeing as far as how much of an increase the associations that we've been working with are facing. And I can share that with you, Peggy, and if you want, you could share that with
Yes.
the group after the fact. It's very interesting and insightful. And that's a
Yes.
question I get a lot, is what are you seeing at other associations? How do we compare? And so this is some really good real world data that I'd be happy to share.
Sure, okay. Let's see. There's a few more here. Do you know the differences between HOAs and the COA reserves?
Generally
HOA.
speaking, HOAs can have voluntary reserves unless they are voted on by the membership to be statutorily restricted or required. And if you have voluntary reserves in an HOA, then the board can really use them however they want, whenever they want. So it's a different world in the HOAs.
Sure, sure. I have one CAM here, has put their CAM number in the chat. When you registered, you would have put it into your registration. So we're not taking anything off this chat box. So you will be accounted for or accredited when we get the end of the closing here. So I think that's pretty much it. Did you have any other closing comments?
Closing comments. No, I'd like to commend everyone for taking the time to learn a thing or two about this. And I hope that this information is useful and actionable. And if you've got a funding plan that looks like we're just putting a lot of money into reserves and ignoring when we need to spend that money, let's talk to our reserve study firm and see if there's maybe more of a strategic approach that we can take that would still be in compliance with the statutes. And hopefully that's going to be some powerful information for you. And I'm excited to help as many of you out as we can. Like I said, we're September, October inspections for the SIRS, but it's not too late yet. So let's chat. Let's get you a spot on our schedule and make it happen.
Nick loves overtime. No.
It's crazy.
Okay.
It's crazy. The demand is absolutely insane.
Sure.
But we're in a position to help out a lot of people, and so I'm energized by that. That's for sure.
Well, when I close here, I always like to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to get on. My hat is off to you all. I commend the board members and the CAMs for continuing your education. You pick up something, or I pick up something every time I hear a new presentation. And I want to thank the sponsors, Michelle for staying on the whole time, Daniel, Katie also. Let me tell you about some upcoming presentations. As Nick mentioned, on June the 4th, that's going to be another in-depth DBPR presentation with a couple of reserve companies, and Nick will be there going into more of the condominium details further in depth, the way I understand it, right, Nick?
Yes,
And-
yeah, they've asked us to really help do a deep dive into the funding, a lot of what we covered today, but it'll be sponsored by them, so they're kind of, signing off on all of that information, which is important,
Okay.
especially when there's different opinions with all of
Okay.
this. Set the
Okay.
record straight.
You know if that's going to be recorded?
I don't know. I can find out and let you know.
Yeah, that would be excellent. Maybe you could recommend it if it's not. Again, June the 4th. I don't know the time. I don't know. Do you know the time, Nick? No.
I do.
Okay.
That is going to be at 11:30 a.m.
Okay. And I'm sure that's going to be a couple of hours, right?
Yeah, it looks like it's slotted for 11:30 to 1,
Okay.
hour
Hour
and
and
a
a half.
half.
Okay.
I'll put a link in the chat just so they have it right away if they want to register.
And then I'll send it out to everyone again, but I'm just stressing June the 4th because it's hard to find on the DBPR website itself. Then followed by that, I have Ray Engineering coming in to make a presentation on June 14th from 12 to 2. The next one is July 2nd. I've got Jane Boland from Peyton Boland making a presentation on all the new laws. So past that, I'm going to say thank you again. And final comments if anyone wants to say something, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Peggy.
Thanks, Peggy.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Good job.